Hi, I'm Dorothy. Are you ready to dive deep into one of the bougiest zip codes in the country? The good, the bad, the ups and downs, the real and the not so real. This is That Greenwich Life. But first, a word from this episode's sponsor.
Ready to elevate your travel experience? Discover Jonathan's Travels, your source for luxury vacations of a lifetime. We have planned thousands of trips crafting the most unforgettable experiences of our clients' dreams, whether it's a bucket list safari, an epic adventure country hopping around Europe, a Disney World vacation with VIP perks, or exploring the cultures of Asia. Named one of the world's top agencies by the Robb Report, Travel & Leisure, and Condé Nast Traveler, we're more than a travel agency. We're your travel partner to create vacations beyond your imagination. Jonathan's Travels, where your journey becomes a masterpiece.
Hey everyone, happy Thursday and welcome back to another episode of That Greenwich Life. I am your host, Dorothy Cascerceri Simone. Thank you so much for joining me again this week, especially after you listened to last week's episode. It was hard. That was a hard one. I'm not going to lie. I really appreciate everyone's support and encouragement. You know, I listened to last week's episode on my drive up to Hartford, Connecticut from Greenwich. I was driving up there to appear on Great Day, Connecticut to talk all about That Greenwich Life. And I had been on the show many times in the past and they invited me back and it was my return to TV. But I was a little bit apprehensive about listening on that drive. You know, I listened to all the episodes back after we record them just to make sure that they sound somewhat coherent. Half the time I feel like my brain is trapped in some other dimension because I'm always like living this mom life. But anyway, I was driving up there because I had my very first TV appearance in maybe like over a decade, 8 years, I think I would say. And, you know, I had a whole career in television. I took a step back when my son was born, when he was about a year old. And really when we moved to Greenwich, I took a step back from TV. And so I went from doing like dozens of segments a month to doing none. And that was a tough transition for me back then. But here I am, you know, driving up to the studio, WFSB, the CBS affiliate up in Hartford, back in the studio, back in the saddle. Felt like a really joyous and memorable, exciting moment. And I thought to myself, I don't really want to like change the energy of the moment by listening to last week's episode because I got really emotional in the studio last week. I got really upset. I mean, it took me like, 15 episodes, I guess, into this podcast to shed a tear. So I guess that's an accomplishment. Although holding back our grief is really not an accomplishment. So I never want to say that. But yeah, I got really emotional. I really surprised myself because I've been through a lot of things and I've been through hell and life is busy now. And I do think about it a lot, but I don't think about it in the way that I did during that episode. So I said to myself, you know what? You got to just do it. You have to use the time in the car to listen to the episode in case there's any production notes that you need to send because life is busy and I don't really have a lot of time to work. And I always have to get ahead with That Greenwich Life, not only, you know, with the show, but I'm always trying to get ahead in general in life, even though I can't ever seem to cross anything off my to-do list. When you have an 18-month-old baby, like completely tearing your house apart at all moments, it's hard. So I figured I had to take advantage of that time while I was by myself and you just have to push through and you have to just do it. So I listened to it and I listened to it back. And when it was over, I just kind of sat there in silence. I may have said the words, actually, I did say the words, holy shit, out loud, just to myself, to nobody in particular, because, you know, I'm driving up there myself in my car. But it was really impactful and it was hard for me to listen back to that. It was hard for me to hear it, but it was also therapeutic. It was difficult, but it was also really beautiful to hear myself talk about this morning, you know, that morning that I remember so well before we left to go on our family vacation to Sicily, where my son was in the car screaming about his baby brother who died, our angel baby. And, you know, I'm not very good at connecting the episodes of the show thus far because my schedule is so busy and, you know, I'm so busy with the kids and the kids are my number one priority. So I record when I can. And sometimes there's like a thought that doesn't continue from one episode to the next. I'm going to try to, you know, do better going forward in kind of connecting the episodes week after week. I think this showed me, thanks to my producer, Tyler, too, this was a point that he made that I really do want to connect the shows, because it's really all the same thought. Like one week to the next, it's the same thought. Even if there's a new guest coming on, there's a limited amount of time each week. And I'm still trying to explain things, with a lot of consistency week after week with the theme of That Greenwich Life. So anyway, last week's episode, it was hard for me. It was. And it wasn't what I went into the studio and set out to record that day, but it goes to show that we're people, right? Like we're emotional, we're humans. And if you're not showing emotion, if you don't have emotion, you might want to check on yourself, if you have somebody in your life, a loved one who doesn't really show emotion, you might want to check in and see if they're okay, because it's natural. It's normal. It's not something to be ashamed of, and it's not something to be embarrassed about. I remember the months after we said goodbye to our baby at 21 weeks, I remember being in restaurants and going with my husband on, a date night, and something would come up and I would just be bawling like in the middle of this restaurant. And it made him, at the time, if I'm being really honest, it made him angry. It made him super uncomfortable. As I'm sure if you're listening, I'm sure that if someone's crying in a public place, there's probably a part of you that also might feel uncomfortable about that. It always ended up with us being in a huge fight, and it made me feel like, what's wrong with me? Like maybe I shouldn't be crying. Why can't I just get better? Why can't I just, get over this, move past it? Why can't I just, feel better? Why can't this pain go away? And all of these horrible things. And it wasn't my husband's fault. Like the way that he was conditioned to understand emotions and expressing emotions, that's what it was about. And, back then I was so mad at him, and I hated him that he wouldn't let me have my pain when it was just coming up. Like it wasn't my choice. I wasn't choosing to be in a restaurant on a Saturday night crying, but I was hurting. I was really hurting a lot during that time. When I would go to therapy during that time, and my therapist, this wonderful woman, Sarah Jameson, who I credit so much for my healing journey, she taught me so much that I missed in the first, 38 years of my life. Things that I'm trying to make sure that my kids, aren't missing now. Like she taught me about pain and grief and emotion, and you really have to allow it. You have to really allow it to come and breathe into it and welcome it. She used to say, like make it a cup of tea and really accept it in order for it to pass. And it took me a while to figure out what that meant, because it sounded kind of weird. Like grief and sadness and emotion, they all come at the most inopportune times. They come at the times that we want to be happy, the times that we want everything to be great, the times that we have a pep in our step. And then bam, like it just hits you. You're driving on the road and like a Mack truck, it just crashes right into your vehicle. And it's a terrible feeling. It's a terrible experience. But what I realized is it's a terrible feeling and a terrible experience if you're not used to it. And who wants to get used to crying and grief? Nobody wants to get used to that. But what's interesting is it's a terrible feeling and a terrible experience for people when other people have emotion like that, because they're not used to it. So when I learned a lot about how to deal with this grief and how to stop resenting it and being angry about it and being angry at it, that's when I think things really changed for me. And look, it wasn't an overnight thing. It took a few years probably, but it's a really beautiful thing if you can figure it out. It took me a while to figure it out. It's a very abstract concept. So, if you're sitting here saying like, well, what do you mean? Like, how do you invite it in for a cup of tea? I mean, I really don't have all the answers, but I can kind of, share with you a little bit about it, so I would say to, like my therapist, like, you mean to tell me that when I'm on my way to my son's pre-K graduation and something hits me, a song or a thought, or I get a text message from a friend saying that she's pregnant. These were big triggers for me back then. You're telling me that I'm just supposed to be fine with breaking down into 1,000 pieces and bawling, like ugly crying, being a hot ass mess. Like I'm just supposed to be fine with that. And I'm just supposed to be like, oh yeah, well, it's all good. It's just grief. Like, hey, grief, what's up? Come on in. We're going to hang for a little bit. No, I used to ask her, how do I do that? I don't understand. I can't do that. Now, in that example, of course, that I'm giving, I'm talking about something where my son is involved and my son is present. And that's a whole other discussion, about how much grief you should really allow a young child to see. In my situation, I really tried to make it, close to none. I didn't want him to see me like that. I learned over time that if it was a situation that I really couldn't help, that it's okay to say, mommy's crying because even adults sometimes get sad, but it's nothing that you've done. It's okay to cry. And in doing that, you can actually model that behavior in a positive way, and you can give a child permission to cry, especially a boy, because I think, a lot of males in society are raised to think that crying is bad, or it's weak, like my husband, who didn't like me crying in the middle of the restaurant. But I learned a little bit about that, and, just telling him, reassuring him, like, it's nothing that you've done. It's okay to cry. But anyway, we can talk about all that another time. But this concept of it's okay to grieve, this is what I really felt like had to be the follow-up to that really difficult episode last week, episode 15, where I broke down. And my producer was so sweet to bring me a box of tissues. But I think it's something important to talk about because we've all been in a situation where we've been grieving, and we all will be in situations where there's grief because we're humans, and it's just something that we can't avoid. And now that I know all of this, and now that I understand it, it's taken me a long time, and it's brought me a long way. It's freed me of all the embarrassment and the guilt and the shame and the beliefs like, oh, here we go again. I'm crying. I'm weak again. This is how weak I am. I think that I'm getting better, and I think that I'm happy, and I've gotten to a place of happiness again. And then here we go. I can't hold it together, crying again. And like these horrible things that I used to tell myself, I just can't even believe I used to speak to myself internally like that. And by the way, there were other people that used to tell me, even some people who I thought were the closest people in my life, people who I thought were a safe space of non-judgment. Those people used to tell me, both with their words directly, but more so with their actions. They used to tell me like, Dorothy, it's time to move on. It's time to just get over it. You lost a baby. Now you need to get yourself together. You need to focus on your son. You need to get back into regular life, be your normal self, be the you that we've all come to expect you to be. And that was very hard. That could actually be a whole show in and of itself, frankly. But it really has been a valuable lesson. I'm going to take a quick ad break, but when we return, we will continue with this conversation. Welcome back to the show. So this valuable lesson, I remember the first time I ever put it into play, this idea of let the grief come and then watch how quickly the wave recedes, because that's what my therapist would always tell me. If you allow it to come, then it will pass. It will move on. If you don't allow it to come, if you try to hold it back, if you try to distract, do all of these things, then it's going to stay. So we were in Disney World. It was Mother's Day. So it was a very emotionally charged day for me, very symbolic. It was 2019, only about 2.5 months after we had lost our baby. And my mother-in-law, God bless her, she swooped in and said, like, SOS, SOS, let's do a trip to Disney World with Nicholas, my son, who at the time was 3.5 years old. She's like, I'll get the rooms at the Grand Floridian. You figure out the flights. Let's go over Mother's Day weekend and let's just have a good time together. And I am so grateful to her for putting that whole plan into action, because it was a great distraction. It was a great, joyful, incredible trip that we all took together. I mean, you go to Disney World, some people hate Disney World. They say, it's like the armpit of America. People are awful. It's so crowded. Like there's, the soda cups are too big. There's too much sugar. And I agree. It is crowded. People say it's too much walking. There's nothing healthy to eat. The ride lines are long. It's not organized. Some of them are broken down because they're so old. But I have to tell you, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have to say, I'm sorry. I appreciate your perspective and it's valid, but I completely disagree. For me, being back in Disney World, I think the time that I had gone to Disney World before that. It was maybe in college. I think my boyfriend at the time surprised me and took me. But other than that, I'd only really been there as a kid, and being an adult and being back there with my son and being in such a vulnerable place coming off of the heels of this tragic loss, and the most debilitating thing you could ever feel would happen, like as a mother, being there for my first Mother's Day with my sweet, sweet boy, was truly the next best thing to being there on Mother's Day with my other sweet, sweet boy, and being pregnant with him, 6.5, or I guess maybe at that point I would have been 7 months pregnant. So that wasn't lost on me. I mean, every single day that I wasn't pregnant after my pregnancy was interrupted, a very wanted baby, we lost a very wanted baby. I thought about it every single day. Like, today I would have been 6.5 months pregnant. Like, today I would have been 7 months pregnant. I mean, my due date is a conversation for another time, but it was hard. It was really, really hard. And so, even though I had all this pain and all of this grief, we did have the most magical time. We did a quick, it was a good lesson, by the way. I have to go back. It was a good lesson in finding the joy and the beauty amidst the darkness and the pain and the grief. And so we did a really quick trip. We flew out of Westchester Airport, which is in White Plains, New York, very close to my house, only like 10 to 15 minutes from my house. We live quite far in Greenwich from LaGuardia, JFK, with all of that traffic. So anytime you can fly out of Westchester Airport, it's the next best thing to flying private, which, of course, as you know, if you've tuned in before, I've done it once. My son did it with me the very first time I ever did it. He was 3, or no, yeah, he was 3. It was that summer. I was, 38. But we don't typically fly private. But anyway, it couldn't be more convenient. At the time, my son, he was and still is now the most adventurous, fun person to travel with. My husband, he's not necessarily as fun. Sorry, John. I mean, it's just the truth. Like, he's an adult and he has more concerns and anxiety when he travels than obviously a child who's just going along with things. But my husband, I'll give him credit. He was just coming off of a red eye from London the night before, being in London for the week for work. And so having to come home from JFK and then coming back to the house and then doing a quick turnaround, leaving at like 5 a.m. the next morning to fly to Orlando, then walking around the Magic Kingdom. Literally, we stopped off at the hotel. We may as well have just like driven past the hotel and thrown our bags on the lawn, because we only stopped at the hotel so briefly after we landed to check in, get our wristbands all sorted, and then headed straight to the park. We were at the park by 11 a.m. that day, and we were at the park all day long. My son, at 3.5 years old, he did not close his eyes until 8:31 p.m. when those fireworks officially ended at 8:30. Or did they end at 9? I can't remember if they ended at 8:30 or 9. Either way, that kid, he stayed awake the entire day. We rode all the rides. It was such an incredible, magical, exhausting day for our family. And my husband's mom, my mother-in-law, she's such an amazing person. It was such a joy to be able to go there with her and with my father-in-law, my husband's stepdad. All in all, it was just so joyful. But guess what? We've talked about a million times in the show, as you know, That Greenwich Life. Yes, it's about Greenwich, Connecticut. Yes, it's about the town and like the fancy shit that goes on and the parties and things like that. But it's a show about the highs and the lows. It's a show about the good with the bad. And I think if you listen to enough episodes, if you're listening right now, you probably know what I'm about to say next. And that is the fact that even though it was joyful, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't perfect. It was still every single second. It was gut wrenching. And I was in a dark place. I was living in a very dark place. I was being treated for PTSD. I was in a place of pain. I was almost like a robot. I was on autopilot. I was barely even functioning or eating. You may not have been able to tell that, if you ran into me there, if you met me, but it was a really, really hard load that I was carrying. And, I had just carried a baby to 21 weeks only to say goodbye to that baby, not because I wanted to, not because it was my choice. And it was a really hard place to be in. And so it was all really beautiful being there, but it was all really emotional. So we got there on a Friday. We did the Magic Kingdom all day long. Saturday, I think we went to Animal Kingdom, or no, I think we went to Animal Kingdom and Epcot in one day. We did so many rides in both places. And then the last day we went to, I always like to call it MGM Studios because that's what it was called when I was a kid. But now I think it's called Disney Hollywood Studios. And so we had everything all lined up for us, all set up for us because my friend and our pediatrician, Dr. Ariel Ornstein, she is an amazing person. She is just like, it's her side gig or whatever you want to call it, a passion project. She's a Disney vacation planner. So she is such a wonderful friend. And she was my first phone call after my 20-week anatomy scan when we found out the absolute worst about our baby. She advised us throughout the entire process, and I just adore her so much. So it made me so happy that she was able to then, plan this really great trip for us. So she set everything up for us, all the different rides. At the time, I think they had like fast passes, or I forget what they called it at that point. It was different. They change it like every few years, it seems like. And there were these little wristband bracelets, and everything was set up for us, and it was amazing. And so, if you're listening and you live in the area, or even if you don't live in the area, you can DM me on Instagram at Dorothy on TV, and I can put you in touch with her because she does all the planning for you, hotel, everything. She makes it easy, all the dinners, literally everything. And you can just show up and follow her very, very detailed instructions. So anyway, on the last day, my husband had to leave. He had to go back to work. He had an important meeting. And we had such a great day the last day because my son at the time was so into Star Wars. And at the time, Disney Hollywood Studios had a huge Star Wars thing, a parade. And I really think that my son's highlight was seeing, what's the person's name? Like Darth Vader, or I don't know, guys. He loves Star Wars. My son loves it. They watch it together. They do everything. I don't know all the names. I'm not a Star Wars person, but he loved seeing all of that. And I think even more so than seeing Mickey and Minnie and meeting them. And so we said goodbye to my husband at Disney Hollywood Studios, and we decided to go back to the Grand Floridian. I don't know why I can never say that. Grand Floridian, where we were staying. Me and my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my son. We had this beautiful dinner. But before dinner, we sat at the lounge, and having this really nice dinner was such a relief because the food in the parks is it's not really that good. It's actually gotten better over the course of time, but this dinner that we had at the hotel was really the first really good meal that we had. But anyway, we sat at the lounge before dinner, ordered some cocktails. My son was sitting there playing with his new little Star Wars figures that we bought him in one of the gift shops. And I was just sitting there and just out of nowhere. I mean, if you've ever experienced grief and that feeling, that when it happens, it just comes out of nowhere. And this is grief. This is how it goes. And, this is why I've tried probably, as much as I have to stay busy and, throughout life to try to process grief in this way of feeling busy, I don't get a lot of time to think about all that has happened. I don't get a lot of time to think about how it affects me still and how it hurts my heart still. And I just don't have a lot of time to think about any of that. So, of course, like last week's episode in this place, in the Pod Populi studio, it's a place where there's quiet, there's actual quiet. And some people, ask me how can you even think about all the things that you talk about? And, I don't know. I don't even know if ever what I'm saying makes any sort of sense. I just cross my fingers and hope that it does. But, here in the studio, it's quiet and I'm by myself. No one's asking anything of me or needing anything of me. And so it makes complete sense as to why I broke down, why I was able to tap into those emotions. I'm going to get back, in a second to, why at this moment on the trip, grief arrived. But, if you wind back to 2019, at this point in our trip it was go, 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 barely even really sleeping. We would sit down in the morning to be at the park for the early 7 a.m. access, in Fantasyland. So we could be on Peter Pan and It's a Small World with all the lines. But, at this point we sat down to have a cocktail, wait for the table. My husband was gone. And I said to my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, I kind of just motioned to them, mouthed the words, I'll be right back. And then I walked away and into the lobby where there was this 8-piece band playing all of the Disney hits. I'll never forget The song from Beauty and the Beast was playing, which was something that I loved when I was younger. I used to take voice lessons, yes, singing lessons. Don't ask. Believe me, I could not even sing right now if somebody paid me. But I used to take voice lessons and used to sing all the Disney songs and piano lessons and play all the songs. So, like the main theme song from Beauty and the Beast was playing, and I just found like a corner of the room. Some people were probably like, what is wrong with this chick? Because I just went to the corner of the room where there was nobody. And I just was almost, how do you describe it? I was almost dry heaving tears, like just hysterically crying. Like, could not contain myself. I was almost throwing up, but it wasn't coming from my stomach. It wasn't like I was throwing up. I wasn't nauseous or even physically sick, which that does happen to some people in these situations where they're dealing with intense grief or intense anxiety. For me, thank God, it's not that. Panic attacks a lot of times look like this. And who knows, maybe it was a mild panic attack that I'm not even totally sure of, but it was just this absolute raw, unapologetic, unforgiving grief. I was throwing up grief. And that's really what it felt like. I was throwing up grief. And I just remember in the moment saying, oh my gosh, like, stop, you're in Disney World. It's like, get back out there, Your son is there, like, stop crying, get yourself together. Like, look at how fortunate you are. Look at how lucky you are. Like, look at this beautiful music. Look at this gorgeous hotel that you're staying in. Like, so many people, don't even have like the chance to come here and experience it. And you're here and you're just sitting in the corner crying. And how horrible to back then that was my automatic way to talk to myself. And so many of us talk to ourselves that way. We don't even realize it probably. We're just on autopilot. And these are just the thoughts and the things that come up. So I remember at that moment thinking about my therapist and making that shift and putting into practice some of the things that she had taught me, which was the importance of overriding those types of thoughts and overriding that language and trying something different on for size, which felt completely foreign and strange, probably because I had never talked to myself like this before. I had always gone to other people so that other people could tell me these words of reassurance, so other people could calm me down. And, I think probably a lot of it comes from the fact that in our childhood, we all go through things where we have to be a certain way. We have to be a people pleaser. We have to be on a certain type of behavior. And I think probably maybe I wasn't allowed to have a lot of grief around my parents' divorce. I had to kind of keep it together and be the happy, well-adjusted child because there was a lot of chaos. And so I think that's what I was used to and something I was conditioned to do. Could talk about, an entire episode probably about that. But, in this situation, I was able somehow, some way to say to myself, like, okay, you know what? Hold on a second. Let's try something different. My therapist talked to me about self-compassion. What does that mean? It's just such a foreign term. Like, what does that mean? I need to treat myself differently. I need to have compassion for myself. But I said, okay, let's just try out this thing. And so instead I stopped and I said, okay, you know what? I stopped all of that negative talk. And I said, you know what? It's okay. Like, it's okay to be upset. Like, it's Mother's Day. It actually was Mother's Day. It was that Sunday of the trip. It was that Sunday of the weekend. It's Mother's Day. Like, you thought you were going to be pregnant. You thought you were going to be 7 months pregnant at this point. And your baby was so unfairly taken from you. Like, you're having a beautiful trip with your son and your in-laws and your husband. You're in Disney World. You are grateful. Those things are all valid, but you are also allowed to have grief. You're allowed to ugly cry. You're allowed to have this moment in this awkward corner. And you can stay here and you can take as long as you need to just breathe and to just cry as hard as humanly possible. I've realized during that time, of life, like when I would cry, it's almost like I wouldn't even shed actual wet tears. It was this like hard, violent crying. Like a crying like I had never really experienced in life. And, I feel a little bit out of breath right now telling this story because it's taking me right back to that place and it's kind of activating my nervous system a little bit. So I'm going to stop for a second. I'm not going to cry again, but even if I did, it would be okay. But I'm just going to take a minute and breathe because it's taking me right back to that place. And so I just stood there and I breathed and I remember feeling really dizzy. And, I didn't go back to those coping mechanisms that I once had. I didn't call someone. I didn't follow that initial instinct to just pull my phone out of my pocket and text someone so that person could tell me that everything was going to be okay. So that person could reassure me that it's natural that I'm crying and it's okay and it's nothing to feel guilty about. Like, where along the lines of life did I miss, these messages? And, I didn't really know what to do with the emotions. And I always felt like maybe if I could talk to somebody, like they can make me feel better. Maybe I should go and grab my mother-in-law and just kind of like ask her to come over here and talk so we can sit and I can talk it out and I can, she can give me a hug because hello, it's probably no surprise if you're listening to this podcast that I have made a career out of talking. And I've made a career out of being on TV and being on radio and now having a podcast and talking. And so anytime I was ever in a sticky spot or if I ever had any inkling of an uncomfortable emotion, how would I cope with it? I would talk. Maybe I was talking by making videos on Instagram. Maybe before Instagram happened, I was making videos and sending them to friends. I was always coping by talking. And that's okay to lean on other people and to talk to other people. But in this moment, it was a hard no. I didn't do any of that. I sat there and I said to myself, you know what? It's okay. I'm going to sit here with these uncomfortable emotions and I'm going to take as much time as I want. I'm going to let the grief be. The grief is here. The grief is just love turned into now sadness for this tragic loss. Just let it be here because the more grief you process, the more healing happens. Grief and healing run together on a parallel trajectory. The more you grieve, the more you heal. And so, of course, everybody wants to heal, right? We all want to feel better. We all want to be more healed, but you can't get there. You can't get there without the grief. You can't get there by partying every single night and drinking tons of tequila shots or bottles of wine. You can't get there by traveling nonstop and planning, like back-to-back, vacations so that you just keep running from whatever it is that you're feeling. You can't get there by exercising maniacally 5 times a day or restricting your food intake or your calorie intake. You can't get there by going online and running up a $5,000 credit card bill. We think that we can process grief and we think that we can numb our pain in these ways, but these are not the ways. These are the ways that we are not allowing grief to be. These are the ways that we do not welcome grief, and these are the ways that we do not allow grief in. Doing all of these things, this is the way that we don't heal. We delay our healing. This is the way that we actually push grief away. We push it back so that we can't feel it. The more you do all these things, the more you don't feel the grief. So maybe you think you're kind of like staying above it. You're staying ahead of it, but no, you're not. And if you're listening, maybe some of these things like you're identifying with, maybe some of these things you're doing or you have done in the past. And so I felt like when I listened to last week's episode, this felt like the absolute correct 100% follow-up thing to express. It was the first thing that came to mind for me after I listened to this, the story in Disney World and this opportunity that I took for the very first time in my life to talk to myself differently about sadness, about discomfort, and to process negative feelings in a different way and to also process them alone. I think my therapist back then used to say, like, you have to kind of be your own parent and you have to kind of talk to yourself in a loving way, like a parent would talk to a child. And so this was the first time that I put into action what my therapist taught me. And guess what? It worked. It absolutely worked. Because I walked back to the table where we were sitting having cocktails. My son was there playing with his cute little Star Wars figurines. So cute. And I felt for the moment so much better. I felt so much better. And part of that also is the release, of the tears. But, it's just all the things that I learned to do. It somehow worked. Like I felt lighter. I didn't feel like, great, I'm good to go. Now, no more grief. I'm over it. But for that moment, just right in that moment, I could be in the present with my son and my in-laws. I could feel happy. I could feel joy. And then the hostess called our table. We went and sat down. We had the most beautiful meal. And it was just so sweet. My son loved this little dessert that he got. He got a souvenir cup with a little blinking, a little blinking ice cube in it that he took home. And we just had all these laughs, and we shared this dessert with chocolate pudding with Oreo crumbles in it and gummy worms. And everybody just felt happy and light. And, it doesn't mean that I woke up the next day and I felt amazing, or even that I went to bed that night and I felt amazing. I didn't. It was Mother's Day. It was Mother's Day 2.5 months after I lost my baby, 2.5 months after my pregnancy was terminated. And I did not feel light as a feather. I felt heavy. I felt beyond grateful to be there with my other baby, with my sweet boy, Nicholas. I felt so grateful for my life, but I also felt just as much pain and sorrow and darkness. And I was struggling deeply with very serious depression during that time that got worse. And I was glad that I was able to put that tool into action. I was glad I was able to give myself grace. And there were several times following that where, it was hard to put those lessons into play in situations of intense grief. I tried, and I thought to myself, why isn't this working like it did in Disney World that day on Mother's Day? But by the way, that's another thing. That's another kind of self-talk. Why isn't it working this time? You can't talk to yourself like that. You can't do that. There's no quick fix. There's no easy answer to pain and to grief, and to feeling uncomfortable and to fixing it for yourself. You have to be gentle, and you have to be gentle with the situation and not demand things, and not demand that, just because it worked that time, it should work again. Life doesn't really always work that way. I kept trying time and again. I kept trying to put those tools back into action. And, you want 6-pack abs at the gym? Well, we all do. I don't have 6-pack abs. I want them. I don't know if I ever will. But let's be honest, how are you going to get them? You have to get in there. You have to really do the crunches. You're not going to do an ab class and then look in the mirror and feel you're ready for the next cover of Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. It's not going to happen. You have to lift the weights. You have to do the machine with the weights. You just can't expect right away that something's going to work. And so over the course of time, over the course of many months, I was trying to keep putting that self-talk into play in those situations to allow the grief. And then I also had to try and help my husband understand that when the grief came and we were together, it would be really helpful to me if you could try to allow it somehow, because I'm trying to allow it. I don't want it to be here. I don't want to be crying in the middle of the restaurant. I don't want to not be pregnant at this moment, but I'm trying to allow it. And I told him, I really need you to try and allow it for me, because it just puts pressure on me when you're making me feel guilty and you're making me feel bad and you're making me feel more broken than I already am. I know I'm broken. I know I was broken during this time. And, it just, it's important to not be judgmental of tears and crying. Which by the way, this wasn't my first time crying a lot in my life. I've always been a crier. Don't get me wrong. I've never been a stoic individual, but I think the things that have hurt me deeply in my life, I think those are things that I never really properly dealt with, and I never really properly grieved. And so I didn't know it at the time, but this whole situation with losing the baby and then embarking on this horrible journey of infertility and failed IVF and miscarriage and multiple pregnancy loss and PTSD and being treated for PTSD with EMDR therapy, I think, it really just was the beginning of my opportunity to heal myself from things that happened way before that anatomy scan. It was a way to heal my nervous system and to heal some of the conditioning that really made me as a person. So if you're listening to this episode this week, I really do hope that there was something in here that you can take forward with you throughout the next week until we meet again next Thursday. I'm not going to do a weekly work on this week. That was a long episode and it just didn't feel right to end it because I think this was really important stuff. But I do thank you all so much for tuning in and for listening and for being supportive. You can always follow me on Instagram at Dorothy on TV. And also my website, DorothyOnTV.com. I have a new shop tab on there, so you can go there to buy That Greenwich Life merch. We have all sorts of great items there, and you can also listen to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to your podcasts. I just am really grateful that you have all given me this platform, of course, Pod Populi, for having me in their studio, and this week's sponsor, Jonathan's Travels. Please go on to Apple Podcasts, leave a review, leave some stars, preferably 5, and just have a really good week. And maybe next week, maybe we'll keep things a little bit lighter next week. But until then, remember, don't just live your life, love it. See y'all next week.